the world. The demand has been absolutely amazing. I'm very glad we moved it from the old school to here at the Phipps Hall, because we could only fit 30 people, and we have over 200 here now, and delighted to see you all. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Diana Gabaldon.
I'm not sure it was designed for me either, but yeah, just a bit. Yeah, that sounds about right. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Yes, well, thanks so much for coming today. They were just telling me that they've raised £2,000 for the Highland Hospice. So that's very lovely. I haven't brought my fiddle, so I probably won't need that. I actually play the French horn, which is even less wieldy. That's actually where I met my husband, was in the French horn section of the Northern Arizona University marching band. I walked in one day and sat down next to this tall redhead, and though I was engaged to someone else at the time, the combination was difficult to resist. And 90 minutes later, I went back and gave my fiancé back his ring. As it is, my father used to say to me, "You're such a poor judge of character, you're bound to marry some bum." He said, so get a good education so you can support your children. So with this going on at home, I thought perhaps I wouldn't admit that I wanted to write novels, which I did. And so I went into science. You know, I like science, I was good at it, but I still wanted to write books. And when I turned 35, I said to myself, well, you know, Mozart was dead at 36, maybe better to start it here. And so I made up my mind that on my next birthday, I would begin writing a book. I wasn't going to show it to anyone, I wasn't going to tell anyone what I was doing, especially not my husband, because he would have tried to stop me. Not out of any objection to my writing a book, but out of fear that I would drop dead, since at that point I had 2 full-time jobs and 3 children under the age of 6. So I don't want any of you telling me you don't have time to write a book. You can. You just don't find time lying around in the streets. You make time, or you haven't got any, is what it amounts to. But in fact, I did not marry a bum. I married a very nice man, whom I still have 45 years later. I did that too. But he did quit work 3 months after our first child was born in order to start his own business. And I do have to say that in terms of financial stability, there's not that much to choose between an entrepreneur and a bum. So as I said, I was a scientist. I was a university professor at Arizona State University. I have a bachelor's degree in zoology, a master's in marine biology, and a PhD in quantitative behavioral ecology. So you see, I took my dad's advice and got a good education. However, I have to say that that didn't amount to enough to support a family of 5 people. So when the need to earn a little extra money became evident, I said to myself, well, aside from prostitution in the home, I said, well, what do I know how to do? Owing to sort of a number of academic accidents that I won't bore you with, I had slid kind of sideways and become an expert in scientific computation. It's really easy to be an expert if there's only 6 people in the world who do what you do at the time. And owing to the onrush of technology, I was one of the first people to do that. It isn't actually complicated. It just means using computers in order to address scientific problems, rather than the science of computers, which is where you learn how to tinker with them and program them and all that. We assume from a scientific viewpoint that the computer is going to work, and we just need to know how to set it up. And so that was my job. I taught international seminars in scientific computation, and I started a little journal called Science Software Quarterly with me as editor, and I wrote half the articles. But when the need to make extra money arose, I wrote a query letter to the editors of Byte and InfoWorld and all the PC magazines. And I enclosed a copy of my Science Software Quarterly and a copy of a comic book that I had written for educational media divisions at Walt Disney. It was titled Nutrition Adventures with Orange Bird. And it was a short letter. It said, "Dear sirs, as you can see from the enclosed, you won't find anyone who knows more about scientific and technical software than I do, and at the same time can write so as to appeal to a broad and popular audience." So this got immediate response, and within 6 months I was making as much doing that as I was at the university, which just goes to show how badly they pay biology professors. question was, what's the easiest kind of book I could possibly write? Because I wasn't writing this book to sell. I wasn't going to show it to anyone or tell them what I was doing. I just wanted to learn how. Because up to this point, I had written all sorts of things, all the guff you have to write for a PhD, including a 400-page dissertation entitled Nest Site Selection in the Pinyon Jay, Gymnorinus cyanocephalus. Or as my husband says, why birds build nests where they do, and who cares anyway? But you have to write all of this kind of stuff, and then, popular science articles, textbooks, documentation, software, instructions, etc., and comic books. But no one had ever shown me how to write any of this stuff. I just looked at a few examples, wrote one, and if it didn't look quite right, I poked it till it did. And I said, well, fine, you've been reading novels for 30-odd years. Surely if you write one, you will recognize it. I said, okay, next birthday, I start writing a novel. And so, next question, what kind of novel? So all I needed to know really was how to write something the size of a novel and something that was fiction, because I'd never really done that. Just, lame short stories for high school writing class, that kind of thing. And I said, what I need to know is what it takes in terms of daily commitment and mental organization, and how do you organize your research, how do you keep track of all the pieces, and I need to know about the nuts and bolts of writing a novel. And once I learned that, then fine, I can go ahead and write a real novel. But this is for practice. I did make 2 rules for myself. I said, one rule, I will not stop. No matter how bad I think it is, I will write the whole thing, because that's what I need to know, is what is it like to write and finish a novel. I know a lot of people, I still know a lot of people who have been writing their novels for 8 years and are not finished yet. And basically what it is fear of failure. If they don't finish it, they don't ever have to let anyone look at it, they don't have to risk rejection. On the other hand, they have not finished a book and they'll die, unpublished. This never seems to hit any of them. But anyway, as I say, I knew people like that, and I said, no, we're not doing that. I'm going to write the whole book and just see what I think. If I think, well, this is really awful, I'm not sure I'll ever be any good, then I can, put it away with a clean mind. But if it shows signs of getting better, well, then I take hope and go on. And I said, so the second rule is, I can do the first, I will do the absolute best I can every single day. Even though this is a practice book and I don't expect anyone to see it, it cannot be sloppy just because this is practice. So I'll just put down any old thing today, or I'm feeling inspired, let's just, wander off. No, you don't do that. I mean, it's as much a sport as it is an art, and it takes just about as much physical endurance and certainly as much mental discipline, to keep doing what you're doing and to do it the best that you can. But like with any sport, you have to practice to get better at it. And you won't get better unless you are trying your absolute hardest to do so. As I tell young writers frequently, I say ballerinas are not born on their toes. And the same is true for writers. It doesn't matter how badly you start out. You can always get better, but you won't unless you apply yourself. It's just that simple. And likewise, time-wise, many people say, oh, I don't have time to write a novel. I have to finish this, I can finish that, but next summer I'll have 6 weeks off and I can sit down and thinking, when that 6 weeks comes, it will already be gone. Things will happen. We'll have us guests who go to Disneyland, you'll go out boating and not come back. Who knows? But I said, look, almost nobody writes with a big chunk of time. There are professional writers who will write for 3 hours or so. But most people can't do it for longer than that. Your brain gets tired, you have to wait and let it reinstall itself. But I said, if you only have 10 minutes a day, if you write during that 10 minutes a day, in about a year and a half, you'll have a book. If you don't write 10 minutes a day, you'll be a year and a half older, but you won't have a book. It's just that simple. So, it's a matter of commitment and how you're going to do it. Well, as I say, owing to what I did, and the 3 children and all that, I was very good at juggling things and writing in small bits and pieces here and there. In fact, I don't have a linear mind. Not everybody does. Those schools would have you believe this. Do we have any teachers present? You might want to put your fingers in your ears for next time. Because every school that I've ever been subject to has approached writing in the same way. They say, well, we're going to teach you how to write. First, you must make an outline. This begins with a topic sentence. Then you must write a topic paragraph. Then you must write a conclusive paragraph. Then you must fill in how you get from the beginning to the end, in a linear order, following the outline that you have made up. Turn in the topic sentence, turn in the topic paragraph, turn in your outline. Okay, now you can actually write the paper. But this is your rough draft, so then turn that in, and then you can edit the rough draft, turn in the edited bit, and then you can write your final polished draft. And I ask teachers when I go to career days, I say about teacher can't see you, so tell me the truth. When you get an assignment like this, how many of you just write the dang paper and fake out the rest? And about half of them will raise their hands because they think like I do. We do not think in a straight line. They just don't see any point to it, for one thing, but also it just seems so slow and cumbersome how to do that. And, but, you know, for some people it works. And the bottom line is that you can get a coherent essay out of a fifth grader by making them do that, no matter how their mind works. Whereas you cannot teach people to write in the way that people who think like I do. I don't know whether it's ADD or some other mental affliction, but as I said, there's a lot of us out here that do that. I call it network thinking myself. You know, when you have Christmas lights, it goes yellow, red, blue, green, purple, yellow, red, blue, green, purple. I'm not sure they have purple Christmas lights, but anyway, when you've got it, you have this nice string and it lights up and you put it around your Christmas tree and it's very pretty. But what if you're a network thinker? Then it's one of those nets that you throw over your cactus or over your front garden. And, you know, and that's beautiful too, but it doesn't work the same way. Maybe current is flowing through it, but it's lighting up lights here, 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 here. When it's all lighted up, then it's just as lighted as the string is, but it's not lighted in a straight line. That's all there is to it. Yeah. So, you know, if your mind does not work in the one thing at a time way, you know, don't panic. You're not doing it wrong. There is no wrong way to write. As long as you get words on the page, whatever you're doing is the right thing. So, you know, the hardest part of writing is learning how your own mind works and getting on with it. But anyway, returning back to the book that I was going to write. There's a reason I write long books. It's because I like digressions. So anyway, I said, what's the easiest kind of book? And I thought, well, I like to read everything. I read all the time, and I read everything as long as it's well written. And I said, maybe I should write a mystery. I read a lot of mysteries. And I said, no, mysteries have plots. I'm not sure I can do that. And so I thought to myself, what's the easiest thing to write? So I thought, well, for me, perhaps historical fiction. I was a university research professor. I knew my way around the library and had access to the international library loan system. You know, I could pretty much find out anything. This was a long way before the internet existed, by the way. It was 1988 when I began writing my first book for practice. And so, you know, online basically didn't exist or was limited to those three information services. We call them GE, Delphi, and CompuServe, which has something to do with the story, believe it or not. That's not a digression. And so anyway, I said, so I could look things up. It seems easier to look things up than to make things up. And if I turn out to have no imagination, I can steal things from the historical record, which works really well. And so I said, okay, I'm going to write a historical novel. Where shall I set this? Because I have no background in history, just the 6 hours of Western civilization they make you take as an undergraduate. And so one time would do as well as another. I said, okay, 15th century Venice, American Civil War, you know, World War I. These are all, you know, good, interesting periods, but, you know, what strikes my fancy? And then I watched a really old Doctor Who rerun on public television. And that for this audience, at least, I don't have to stop and explain who Doctor Who is. And so, well, of course, you know who Doctor Who is, and that he's given to picking up companions from different periods of Earth's history. Well, this really old one was one of the Patrick Troughton, the second Doctor's films, and he had picked up a young Scotsman from 1745, who in fact he took off the field at Culloden, and wretchedly enough, at the end of that companion stint, he put him back on Culloden field, which I thought was a pretty trick, but possibly they didn't realize the Scots lost that one. Anyway, this young man appeared in his kilt, and I said, well, that's really fetching. And I found myself still thinking about this the next day in church, and I said, well, doing my book, it doesn't matter where you said it. The important thing is pick a spot and get started. So I said, fine, Scotland, 18th century. So that's where I began, knowing nothing about Scotland or the 18th century, having no plot, no outline, and no characters. Nothing but the rather vague images conjured up by the notion of a man in a kilt, which is, of course, a very powerful and compelling image. In fact, many years later, when I got to my sixth big novel, A Breath of Snow and Ashes, that was a very lucky book for me. It won several awards, including a Quill Award, for which I beat both George R.R. Martin and Stephen King, which was very gratifying. And also I won the Corina International Prize for Fiction, which was very cool. I got to go to Germany to accept it. And while I was there, the German publisher had me interviewed by everybody in the German press, you know, from the tabloids on up to their equivalent of Guardian and everything. But it on like every half hour all day for a week at the end of this. But I was talking to some nice gentleman from a literary journal, and he said, oh, I read your entire work. He said, your imagery is marvelous. Your characters are so three-dimensional. Your narrative drive is tremendous. And I'm thinking, yes, go on. Instead, he said, there's just this one thing. I wonder, could you explain to me, what is the appeal of a man in a kilt? Well, he was a man and a German. But I looked at him for a minute. I was really tired. I might not have said it, but I just looked at him and I said, I suppose it's the idea that you could be up against a wall with him in a minute. In case any of you gentlemen were wondering. But as I say, very powerful and compelling image. So with this in mind, I went immediately to the library and began looking up Scotland in the 18th century. And even back before the days of electronic card catalogs, there was a lot to find. I just looked under Scotland, Highlands, 18th century, and up came 400 books about everything about Scotland, customs, language, geography, etc. In fact, the only thing you cannot find out a place by research is how it smells. Scotland actually smells really good and extremely various, but you won't find that in a book. You won't find it in one of my books, though, because I always put it smells. But I didn't find that out until I got here. In fact, when I wrote what turned out to be Outlander, which was sold here as cross-stitch initially, in case any of you have cross-stitch and are wondering what's the difference. There are a couple, but it's basically the same book. And I told the UK publisher, I said, for God's sake, have a Scot read it. I've never actually been there. And so they gave it to Diana Gabaldon, who sent back, a page or two of just, small things. One of the things she said was, well, you described Loch Ness as smelling like sun-warmed stone and raspberry canes. She said, I've been there, and it really smells like old mud and dead fish. I said, right. Change that. But, good research is the key to believability. You find it where you can. So anyway, what I was looking for in my initial research was conflict. See, this was the only thing I actually knew about novels, was that they should have conflict in them. So you don't look for conflict in Scotland in the 18th century for very long without running smack into Bonnie Prince Charlie in the 45. And I said, okay, that looks like plenty of conflict. We'll use that fine. And let's see, from my 3 days basic research, it said it basically looks like the Scots versus the English. So I think I must have a lot of Scotsmen because of the kilt factor. But it would be a good idea if I had a female character to play off these guys. They won't have sexual tension, that's conflict, that's good. And if I make her an English woman, we'll have lots of conflict. So I, on the third day, introduced this English woman. I had no idea who she was, what she was doing there, how she got in the plot. But I nursed her into a cottage full of Scotsmen to see what she'd do. Well, they were all sitting around the fire muttering to each other, and when she walked in, they turned around and stared. I was thinking, why? Is there something wrong with her? And she looked funny. And one of them stood up, and he said, my name is Dougal Mackenzie, and who might you be? Oh, without my stopping to think, I just typed, my name is Clara Elizabeth Beecham, and who the hell are you? I said, well, you don't sound at all like an 18th century person. So I fought with her for several pages, trying to beat her into shape and make her talk like a historical person. But she wasn't having any of this. She just kept making smart-ass modern remarks, and she also took over and started telling the story herself. And so I said, well, it doesn't matter. Nobody is ever going to see this book. It doesn't matter what bizarre thing I do. Go ahead and be modern. I'll figure out how you got there later. So it's all her fault that there's time travel in this book. At that point, of course, I gave up thinking that it should be any particular kind of a book. It was still historical fiction, but time travel in it, what's next? The Loch Ness Monster. And so I said, well, why not put him into? Yes, unfortunately, he didn't make it into the TV show. They thought for a while they could CGI one, but then they thought it would be too expensive. So they added that scene. So the next question I'm usually asked is, how did you get from writing this practice book that no one was ever going to see to actually being published? Well, as I say, there's digressions and then there's digressions, and this is the one that wasn't. You remember my telling you about one of the information services called CompuServe. This was one of the early ways of being online and almost the first type of social media. People would form these little special interest groups or forums dedicated to old cars or gardening or flowers or more technical subjects. Well, I was one day sent a piece of software to review by Byte magazine, and they enclosed with it a free membership to CompuServe. And they said this particular vendor has a support forum for their software on CompuServe, and they'd like you to mention that in your review. And I said, okay, fine, why not? So I went online, did this, and wrote the review. Well, I had 4 hours of free connect time left. And this was back in the day when they charged $30 an hour to be connected to what was not yet the internet. And I am not Scottish, but $120 is $120. And so I said, what else is in here? I'm going to waste the money. So I started poking around and came across this group of people called the Literary Forum. These were people who liked books. Most of them were readers, big readers. Many of them were writers, aspiring writers, in-between writers, published writers, famous writers, a couple. So it was fascinating to you. And for someone with 2 full-time jobs and 3 small children, it was the ideal social life. So I plugged in, so to speak, and began hanging around there every day, using it as a break between the different things that I was doing. Well, I'd been there for about a year when I made up my mind to write my practice book, and I did not tell any of these people what I was doing either, because I'd seen way too many of them talk about something they were going to do, and then it never got done. You'd never see a word of it, and people would sort of roll their eyes when someone new came in and said, oh, I got this great idea for a book, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I'm like, so, because they all knew how to write books, so to speak. Anyway, I had seen this happening, and so I said, well, I'm not going to tell anybody. And so I just continued working quietly on my own. About 8 months into this project, though, I was working late at night, which is what I always did. I still do. I work between midnight and 4:30 in the morning is my main time, except when traveling, and then it's a shorter time. But I would work on multiple things at a time, and in between things, I would flip into CompuServe just to pick things up. Well, I found myself one night having a desultory back and forth argument with a gentleman about what it feels like to be pregnant. And he said, oh, I know what that's like. My wife's had 3 children. And I laughed and said, yeah, Lester, I've had 3 children. And he said, can you tell me what it's like? I said, I can, yes, but it's kind of complex. I don't think I can fit it in a 30-line message slot. I'll put this little piece that I wrote 4 months ago, in which a young woman tells her mother in some detail what it's like to be pregnant. I'll put this in a library, and you can read it. And so I did, and everyone who'd been following the argument went, read this piece. I came rushing back, and they said, well, this is cool, what is it? And I said, I don't know. And he said, where's the beginning? And I said, I haven't written that yet. And they said, well, put up some more of this. We're fascinated by these people. We want to know what's going on. And I said, I'll let you know as soon as I find out. But, to have someone actually like what you wrote and want to see more, this is like straight heroin to a writer. I mean, you'll do anything. Well, you'll certainly at least write another piece. And so I took to, whenever I had a scene that would stand alone without a lot of explanation, I would put it up for them once every 2 or 3 months, maybe a 5 or 6, 10-page scene. And people got more and more interested. And they'd say, well, Diana has a new chunk, have you read it? And they'd all read it, talk about it, and ask me questions. And more people would be intrigued, would go off and come back. And anyway, I began to develop this odd little club of followers, so to speak. And a number of people there were actually writers. And many people started saying, well, you should try and publish this. I said, well, it's a book for practice. I don't even know what kind of book it is, but, for the sake of argument, eventually I'm going to write a book that I might like to publish. What should I do? And many of the writers were very helpful in sharing their stories and their advice. All of them said the same thing. They said, get a literary agent. They said an agent can do 2 things for you. He or she can get a much quicker reply from a publisher about your manuscript than if you're sending it to the slush pile. This is true. I've seen the insides of editors' offices. They're floor-to-ceiling paper, and the mailroom is much worse. So even if you've written an absolutely great book, it's going to take an editor 2 years to work their way down to it for all of this. The good news is that 99.9% of what's in the slush pile is in fact slush. So when she does hit your good book, and she's going to buy it. But it will take much more time than you like. Whereas if it comes in through an established agent, they know that the book has been pre-screened. It's legible, it's literate, and it might even be something they want. So they'll jump on it immediately and read that in preference to digging through the slush pile again. So I said, well, that makes sense. What's the other thing an agent can do? And they said, well, the other thing is that if the book does sell, and that's a matter of finding the right editor for it, because sometimes an editor will like your book, but they bought another book in the same genre the week before, and there's just no room for it on their list. So it's nothing against your book, that just doesn't fit there. They said things like that happen, but assuming that a match is made between editor and manuscript, the agent can negotiate a much better contract for you than you could do for yourself. This is true. Literary contracts are Byzantine. They contain rights that you never even heard of, but your agent has, and he can negotiate those rights for you. my first agent called me up one day after we got an offer, and he said, well, I'm going to break out your Canadian rights. He said usually those would go to the U.S. Editor if the author is an American, or to the British editor if the author is from the UK. He said, but I think those might be worth something on their own, and so I'm just going to take those out of the contract. So he did. 6 months later, he sold them to Canada for $45,000 a book, which I thought was pretty good. So, anyway, in getting an agent, that's the next question, is how do you get an agent? And as I said, I've been talking to all of these people who had agents, and they said, well, that's probably the best thing, is talk to people who have agents. But otherwise, you can go to writers' conferences. Some agents go to these conferences, more or less looking for talent, but also as kind of pro bono to give people advice on how to submit manuscripts, and what makes a good pitch, and things like that. You can subscribe to something like Publishers Lunch online or Publishers Weekly magazine. These have stories about prominent agents and who they represent and so forth. Or you can look at books by people whose work you think is similar to your own. Because almost all authors, if they have acknowledgments in their books, will acknowledge their agents, because agents are so valuable to them. But that way you can see who handles books like yours, or who might like yours, and if they're publishing this person or representing this person, then they might also like what you write. And it's important that a literary agent like what you write, or you won't be able to sell it convincingly. So I said, well, that all makes sense. I'm not done writing, so I will just go on asking questions. And I did. And a few months later, I happened to run into a friend online called John Stitt, who was writing science fiction mysteries. I said, well, I'm asking everybody about agents. John, do you have one? He said, I do. He said, by coincidence, is the same as so-and-so, this other writer that we both knew. He said, his name is Perry Knowlton. And Perry Knowlton was somebody that I'd had in mind since seeing the other author talk about him. He seemed to be very eminent. He represented a lot of best-selling authors. I wanted someone whose name would be recognizable to editors. And he was in New York. New York is the heart of publishing. So, if you're a writer, you can live anywhere. But if you work in publishing, you kind of have to be in New York. And traditional publishing, we're not considering what's called indie publishing, because that's a whole different can of worms. And it didn't exist back when I wrote my first book. So anyway, he said, Perry Knowlton, would you like me to introduce you to Perry? And I said, that would be really nice, John. I was afraid John would be run over by a bus or leave CompuServe before I finished the book. So I said, yeah, go ahead, introduce me. So he wrote a quick note to Perry saying, I know this woman from CompuServe. People think she's hilarious. I think she's maybe worth looking at. And I followed that with my own query. Said to Mr. Knowlton, I've been writing and selling my writing for many years. It was all nonfiction, but still people paid me for it. The subtext is because I do know how to write, and people will pay me for it. I've been writing and selling nonfiction by myself for several years. But now that I'm writing a novel, I understand that I need good literary representation. You've been recommended to me by John Stitt and Judy McNaught, Carolyn Cherry, and all these other people from CompuServe. In other words, these people know me. You can check with them to make sure I'm not some raving maniac. And they all, think you walk on water. I have this very long book. I don't want to waste your time, and so I appreciate how busy you are. But I would be happy to send you excerpts if you're willing to read them. I didn't tell him I wasn't through writing, and excerpts were all I had. But he kindly called back, giving me a heart attack, and said, yes, he would be happy to read my excerpts. So I hastily wrote a 26-page, single-spaced synopsis of what I thought was going to happen in the book. Not all of it did, but that didn't matter, as long as it kind of hung together. And I sent this with the excerpts, and he took me on the basis of an unfinished first novel, which is not usual. It does happen. The last time I heard of it happening was The Horse Whisperer, but it does happen periodically. Anyway, this was straight good luck, and so I settled down to write the rest of the novel. Well, when I had finished it, I mailed it to him, and I called his office to tell him it was coming. And I also told him at the time that I would be in New York the next week for a scientific convention. I had timed it that way. And perhaps we could have lunch or something. And he said, oh, yes, come up to the office. I'd love to meet you in person. So the next week in New York, and I went up to his office in some trepidation of mind, because at this point, he was the only person in the world who had read the whole manuscript, and I didn't yet know what he thought of it. So as I said, I was sort of palpitating, but he turned out to be a lovely older gentleman who was very charming for me, my ease, or tried to, and he got me a Diet Coke and started chatting about some of his other authors. At this point, I found out that in addition to my CompuServe friends, he also represented Tony Hillerman, Frederick Forsyth, and Robertson Davies. And I'm sitting there thinking, if you have the nerve to call Robertson Davies Robbie, which he's doing, you're a better man than I am. But what was most unnerving was that he had my manuscript on the desk in front of him in the big orange box in which I'd shipped it. And I was sure that at some point he was going to say, well, having read the whole thing, it's just too weird, there's nothing I can do with it. But, keep me in mind next time you write something. So I was expecting at any moment to hear this. Instead, he said, the thing about Freddie Forsyth and Robbie Davies and those guys is that they're all great storytellers. He put a hand on the box and smiled at me and said, and you're another one. Well, at this point, I was so gratified I didn't care what he did with the book. But I did ask, I said, okay, what are you going to do next? And he said, well, I'm sending it out this afternoon to 5 editors who I think might like it. And he told me who they all were and why he thought they might like it. And I said, that's great, how long do you think we might have to wait for the reply? And he said, well, I've told them all I want an answer in 30 days. And I'm thinking, well, you picked the right agent. So I went home to wait for 30 days. Instead, 4 days later, I get a call on my answering machine. We still had answering machines. And it said, this is Terry. I just called to update you about your manuscript. Call me back. So expecting to hear that at least one of them had said, here, I'm not reading a 10-pound book, take it back. I called up expecting to hear that. And instead he said, well, of the 5 people I sent it to, 3 of them have called back with offers to buy it. And so I'm going to negotiate amongst these. And I was like, okay. So he did, and negotiated for 2 weeks. He merged with a 3-book contract, and being I was a novelist. So. We're actually at the right time. So we now have a good 15 minutes for questions and answers if you have any. And feel free to ask me anything about either the books, the TV show, or otherwise. Yeah.
You said the way that you write is kind of hodgepodge. It comes to you, you write it down, you might use it, you might not. How do you know when a book is done?
Well, I start out with these miscellaneous bits and pieces that are stimulated either by whatever I've been thinking or by the research or some combination. And almost all of them do end up in the book. But as I go on working, I do the research and the writing at the same time. As I go on working, they kind of stick together. I'll write something and I think, oh, this explains why that happened. So let me put this over on this side. And then reading through that longer piece, I can see what has to happen next. So I write that. And then later another piece will come and fit in here. It's like playing Tetris in my head, but very slowly. And so as they fit together, I begin to see the shape. Now, as I say, I'm doing research all the time and kind of building up a historical timeline in the back of my head. It's kind of the timeline or the backbone of the book. This battle definitely happened before this exploration, and this person died over here, so you can't have him occurring after that, and things like that. So after maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years, depending on interruptions, I will have 7 or 8 of these large chunks that are 40 to 60 pages of contiguous stuff. And I can line those up roughly along this backbone in chronological order, because I say, well, this has to happen here because it's concerning that battle and so forth, and this is the aftermath, so it's over there. And by the time I put those chunks in, I will be able to see the overall shape of the book. All my books have an internal geometric shape, which the reader is not usually noticing that's there. If I told you what it was, you would be able to see it in every single book. They're all different. But once I've seen that shape, then the writing gets faster because I don't know what's missing and where to go. Yeah, okay.
With all your books, and you've got little bits written in different languages, and I'm assuming you don't speak all the languages in your books.
Very few of them, yeah.
So how do you do that?
Well, I have the internet has helped a lot on that, but basically I have the acquaintance of a lot of people who do speak those languages. And so what I do is I'll write out what it is I want to say in English, and I will send this bit to my French translator and say, can you do me this one? And he will. And likewise, I have the services of the inestimable Kathy Ann McPhee, Gallic, in my books, which is why all the Gallic in my books has a Vera accent, because that's where she's from. She's the most thorough of the translators. I can't just send her a line because she'll say, well, now tell me who's speaking and who are they talking to and how old are they and what's the social relationship between them, because that alters how they would say this. And I say, okay, I'll just send you the whole scene and you can tell me how you think it should go. So I can assure you that the Gallic is extremely authentic. We do have trouble with the proof, with the compositors, who are typing things in and so forth, because they don't have Gaelic words words in their word banks and so forth, so they have to type it in a word at a time. And you have all the fundas, the whole, accents that go both ways and all that. So sometimes they mistake a B for an R because the whole word makes no sense to them, so they can't even see that it's wrong, and let alone the accents. So I always have to send them back to Kathy Ann to check all those things out, and sometimes one gets past us, but we're really careful about it. Yeah, yeah.
Have you given any thought to what comes after Outlander?
Yeah, I have a few things in mind. Well, Master Raymond is one thing. He'll get certainly one book, maybe more. I was also in the middle of writing a modern mystery, but I sort of had to stop working on something else, but also because it was dealing, the two premises on which the story turned were border issues in the U.S. and also the ideals of journalism and what it's like in a changing world. And both those issues are changing so fast that if I wrote the book now, it would be obsolete in 6 months, and I didn't want to do that. So I said, well, I'm just going to stop working on this for the time being and hold it in abeyance until those things either settle down or I see a way through that changing thicket. Yeah.
Thank you. A couple of things first, very quickly. On behalf of Old Scotland, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And on my behalf, thank you so much, because I'm called Diana, and for some strange mental connection, I have loads of clients and I'm a tour guide. And my question is, now that you know Scotland better than most Scottish people, would you change anything in Outlander's cross-stitch? If you had to rewrite it today, would you put anything else? Would you change anything?
Very, very little. I mean, I have a bigger Scots vocabulary now than I did then, so there are some lines, that I might amend a little bit. But no, I don't think I would change anything that happened. That's all very, that's a very tightly constructed book. All the pieces rest on all the other pieces. So you really couldn't pull one piece out of it. That's why I've always told people it's impossible to make a 2-hour movie out of that book. And believe me, many people have tried. Yes, in the middle.
I'm quite interested in the fact that you've never been to Scotland before you've written the books, and you managed to capture the characters of the Highland men and women very, very well, with tenacity and humour and things like that. How did you manage to do that, given you've never been here before?
I read books written by Scottish people, many of them. Novels especially, but non-fiction as well, especially ones that had quotations in them of what people actually said under different circumstances. But also, I began listening to Scottish singers, the Corries and others of that ilk. And especially, I would buy CDs of live performances because then you could hear the band talking with the audience in between, and you pick up quite a lot of the flavor. So, and whenever I met a Scot, I said, "Here, come, let me buy a cup of coffee and talk to me for a while." Yes.
When did you first set foot in Scotland?
Oh, that was in 1992. Outlander cross-stitch was published in 1991. It was published in 1992 here. But I was writing the second book, Flying Amber, and my contract at the university came up for renewal. And I said to my husband, well, we won't starve if I quit my job. It would be nice to see what it's like to sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch. I said, so let's do that, and I think I really must go and see what Scotland looks like before I write anymore. So we did. We gave the kids to my parents for 2 weeks, and came, rented a car, and spent 2 weeks driving all over Scotland looking at things and collecting Gaelic dictionaries and so forth. That's what I used for the first 2 books, was Gaelic dictionaries, which is why the Gaelic got a lot better on the 3rd book. And I acquired actual native speakers. Yeah, no, there, yeah.
I'm a little worried about Jamie, and the future of the Lallydrock tenants. I'm hoping that you're going to build a bridge at some point in some of your stories, because they're there for the early adventures. I know what happened in 1846, and I'm nervous of letting out spoilers or ruining any plans that you have that I don't know about.
My guess is that I'll die before we get to 1846.
Jamie and his descendants are going to be left in charge of the land and the tenants for a while, and they weren't there later on. So you are going to have to deal with it. Please.
Oh. No, I'm pretty sure I know what happened, but So the actors and how well they match what I thought in the book. Well, none of them actually look like my mental pictures of the people in the book. You know, and Sam Hewitt is the same, rough physical outline. And people say to me, well, he's too short, he's supposed to tower over people. I say he's 6'3", he would be towering over the 5'8" people in the 18th century. It's just that since this is modern times, all of the other actors are about 6 feet, so what are you going to do? Look for a 7-foot actor and hope he can act? No, I think that all of the actors they've been using are absolutely fabulous, because it isn't important what an actor looks like so much. You want sort of a general outline or aspect. Claire needs to be attractive looking. She needs to have the curly hair, because that's as much part of her character as Jamie's red hair is his. Jamie in the book does not have curly hair. Sam Hewitt's hair goes like this. If it's not, plastered down. So, we just do it. But they can be the characters. That's what an actor's magic is, to actually embody someone that they're not. And it's just fascinating to watch them do it. My husband and I went to South Africa to watch filming, visit the set last month. In fact, we were watching from the director of photography stand, where you see everything on the monitor and you have a little earbud so you're hearing. We were watching Sam and Katrina messing around before the next take, and afterward my husband said, how can they do that? 1 minute they're giggling and poking each other, and the next minute they're Jamie and Claire, pow, like that. Said, well, they're actors, that's what they do. What they get paid for. Anybody in the far right? So, yes, back there.
Diana, a low distance geographically, the Native American tribes are quite similar in their history with the Scottish clans. And in a way, I'm wondering that our Claude being your Wounded Knee, our Highland Clearances being your Trail of Tears in a way, were your Native American roots influential in depicting the native roots from this part of the world in Scotland when you created the story of Outlander?
I was aware of quite a bit of it just from the preliminary research. As I said, I was looking widely at the whole 18th century, so I'd come across mentions of this, that, and the other. Actually, in the fullness of time, there will be a prequel novel concerning Jamie Fraser's parents in the 15, so we'll get some of the earlier stuff. And we mentioned the clearances just in passing, but we may mention them more. The 1730 clearances were what resulted in Highlanders being in North Carolina to start with. Then there were the more serious clearances later on, and I don't know if we'll get as far as that. But we did mention the Trail of Tears, and in fact, Jamie warned the Cherokee with whom he was friends and said, this is going to happen. My wife is a seer, and she's seen this in a dream. And the Indians being believers in such things, they took him seriously. They left and went up farther into the mountains, which in fact a number of the Cherokee did. They weren't all removed. Lady of the Montana.
In the first novel, The Cross Stitch, there was a serious man underneath a lamppost.
Is the ghost?
Who is he? Is he going to be addressed?
Yeah, well, it is Jamie, of course. But what he's doing there will have to be addressed, but it'll be the last thing in the last book, and I'm not there yet.
You noticed that the book's first was Outlander in America, it was cross-stitched in the UK. I'm really honest, and I did judge the book by its cover when it was cross-stitched in the UK. I never read it. I was over in the States, I picked up a copy of Outlander, and I was blown away by it, to be honest. How do you feel about the name cross-stitched in the UK and the changes that were made?
Well, it's an interesting story. Cross-stitch was my working title for the manuscript. It's not a particularly good title. It's sort of a weak play on a stitch in time. And also, when I began writing it, I thought Claire would go to the past and then come back to the future. So, cross. But like I say, it's not a good title. It's just what I called it. My agent sent it out under that title. Well, we sold it in the U.S. first, and the U.S. said, well, cross-stitch sounds kind of like embroidery. It's rather boring. You think of something more exciting. And so it took maybe 11 months after that before we finally came up with Outlander after trading suggestions a little back and forth. And their response to that was, oh good, it's only one word, it won't cover up the art. But it's worked out all right. But when I sold it to the UK 6 months later, they said, oh, we love the book, they said it's just lovely, but we can't call it Outlander because to us an Outlander is someone from South Africa. I said, oh really, I didn't know that. Neither do a lot of Scots, as far as I can tell. But they apparently thought that. She said, can you think of something else? And I said, well, originally I called it cross-stitch. And she said, oh, no, nobody published it under that. Not surprisingly, I have had several letters from British readers saying, it's a funny story about how I found your first book. I was shopping in the handicraft section of my bookstore. But the UK also made several other changes. research. So they gave the manuscript to a Glaswegian copy editor, and essentially, I think from what she did to it, that they must have told her, this woman knows nothing about Scotland, you're going to change everything she wrote. Because, well, it went through and she would change details that were perfectly right. You know, I had one line about crows rising out of the furrows in the fields, and she changed it to seagulls. Well, admittedly, you don't have seagulls in the fields in the Highlands. You have crows in the very same fields along with the seagulls. It's not wrong. But there are a lot of those little irrelevant changes going through the book. And they asked if I would remove one sex scene. It's the chapter called Raiders in the Rocks. Takes place after the raid for the grants. And they said, we think that's maybe a little too explicit for our readers. I said, well, it's not structurally linked to anything else, so all right, you know your own audience. And they said, oh, good, and could you perhaps change this other scene just a little bit? You don't need to take it out, but if you could change it so it looks like they're having normal sex. So that, of course, we all do that, but we don't like to admit that we do. This was an English woman, mind you. So I said, all right, so I think a couple of minor changes like that, but otherwise it's exactly the same story. Yes, that's the
When's the next book out?
What's the next book out? This that I'm not writing because I'm here talking to you. So, I get less writing done when I'm traveling, it's part of it. But I don't know, books have their own time. Book 9, it's called Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone, and it's going along very well. So I think I succeeded in not going anywhere for the first 3 months of this year. And then I've been traveling nonstop since March 31st. And I will be going home in another week and a half. And after that, I'm not going anywhere again until later in the year. And if only because our first grandchild is being born in mid-July, so I'm going anywhere this summer. Which means I can stay on the road. So it'll be rolling along a little faster, but I don't know when it'll be done. The publisher starts calling me up about a year before they think it should be done and saying, well, I don't want to pressure you at all. But, you know, it would really help if we could just estimate when this might happen, because we have book presses and binderies and all that. I said, no, we can get through this. This happens every time. You always ask me. I will give you my absolute total best estimate of when I will be done. I'm always wrong. It will always be longer than I think it will. It will always take longer than I think it will. I said, you know this. However, my estimate is, such and such. Next thing I know, I log on to Amazon and find that they're taking pre-orders for 3 months prior to my estimate. Wishful thinking reigns supreme. But the bottom line is that it will be the best book I can write. Because, as I say to them, look, I know this causes you undue stress, and you have to come and spend extra money doing binderies and rescheduling press time and all that. I said, but this is temporary, But if the book hits the bestseller list, which we firmly expect it to, you'll all be happy. And if I wrote a bad book so you could have it 3 months earlier, that book would be out there forever with my name on the front, so not happening. Yes, there. Yeah.
Since writing the book and actually having been in Scotland several times and seeing real standing stones here, which of the standing stones that exist here do you feel are the closest to what you imagined when you first had that scenario in this book? Is there a place that you feel that's it? Or?
Callanish is probably the most, resembles most my imaginings. But there's a lot of standing stones in different configurations. And we went and looked at an awful lot of them when we were skiing in Scotland. But I had something like that vaguely in mind. Now the Playbook Cairns are not far off, but people are often convinced that it is the Playbook Cairns and so forth. But I said, if Claire had been there, don't you think she would have mentioned these enormous cairns in the middle of the place? No, in fact, I didn't even know about the Playbook Cairns until we did come to Inverness for the first time. Yeah, any other question?
If you could be a character in one of your books, who would you be and why?
I could be a character in one of my books. Who would I be in one? But I'm a character in my books. I'm all of them all the time. I don't have to pick and choose. Mind you, there's a group of fans where I live who take me out to tea once in a while and pick my brains. And on one of these occasions, they got started on the character of Black Jack Randall. They were like, oh, he's such dumb, he's so loathsome, I hate him, he makes my skin crawl. I'm sitting there sipping my tea and thinking, you have no idea, you're talking to Black Jack Randall. I don't want to neglect the people in the back, because I remember here. Over there. No. close to being done, and then it began to be obvious to me how that was. But no, each book has its own ending, and I don't usually know what that is, nor do I know the beginning. I just begin writing where I can see something happening. And I sense a certain restlessness to my left, so I think we're probably out of time having this one sign books, but I would love to see most of you a little bit